Well, hey, the other day I was watching TV with my kids, and in the midst of kind of the show that they were watching, a commercial came on. And, you know, it's funny because I sit back and I'm like, oh, commercials, those are inconvenient. But I forget the reality that my kids haven't really grown up in a world where commercials exist for them, because most of what they do is stream. And so naturally it was a kind of a cliffhanger type of moment in the TV show that they were watching, and the commercial comes and my kids start getting angry that the commercial came on. And I kid you not, in the midst of their rant about why do commercials even exist, they saw the toy that was being advertised, and they slowly lowered their volume until they were no longer complaining at all. It went something like this: oh, I can't believe that there's commercials that are stopping the show. Where do you think they sell that, Dad? You know, like that kind of thing. And they were locked in. It was the craziest thing. They went from like full attention and disbelief to like being totally drawn in to the commercial. I told them that they need to learn about what a TV guide channel is, and now they can learn the real meaning of patience. So here's the funny thing, though. I mean, that is the world they live in. They live in a world where commercials don't exist, where interruptions don't really happen. Yet, the reality is that is what they experience on a day-to-day basis, because they are constantly having interruptions pop before them. Their attention spans are lowering by the decade. In fact, that's exactly what research is showing. Time magazine reported that in the early 2000s, a team of researchers tracked people while they were using their electronic devices and noted that each of their focus shifted to something new roughly every 2.5 minutes on average. And then in a recent study that repeated this kind of same experiment, the researchers found that the average had gone down to about 47 seconds. 2.5 minutes to 47 seconds. And then a similar study was done on Gen Z, and it found that their attention spans are around 8 seconds long. And they assume that Generation Alpha, it will be even lower. The trend will continue. In fact, Microsoft researcher Linda Stone, she described this generation with continual partial attention disorder. Continual partial attention disorder, meaning that this generation, us, people growing up in this time, will always kind of give you not our full attention, but our partial attention. We'll like kind of be there with you in the meal, but we'll also kind of have our phone facing us. We'll like be listening to you, but we'll also have the TV on. And it's kind of funny when we talk about it in terms of our habits with TV, but it's a different story when we begin to look at it, how this research is having an impact on our faith and relationship with God. Because really what this research is showing us is that our inability to be fully attentive to what's happening around us is robbing us of our ability to be present to others, be present to ourselves, and most importantly, to be present to God. In many ways, it feels like Jesus' words in Matthew 16:26 are more true than ever, that we have gained the whole world and yet lost our souls. And perhaps this is why Ronald Rolheiser said this, that we are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion. I mean, this feels true for us. And so what is the answer? How do we respond in this hyper attention deficit world? Well, last week we discovered together that we really believe that the answer is found in Psalm 46:10, which says this: "Be still and know that I am God." The invitation for you and for me in the midst of this attention, distraction-oriented world is to be still and to know that God is who he says he is. If you're just joining us for the first time, we are working our way through what we call a way of life. This is a tool that helps us ultimately bear fruit and fruit that lasts, like Jesus talks about in John 15. And so what we are doing for the remainder of 2024 is we are walking through this way of life, devoting a month at a time to each of the practices that make up our way of life as a church. And this verse, Psalm 46:10, is really at the heart of our first practice, which is known as solitude. Last week, we discovered together that solitude is the practice of being still and quiet in the presence of God. Said another way, solitude is the intentional setting aside of time to be with God. This practice is often paired with silence and stillness as well. And in solitude, we create space to simply be with Him. And we introduced this picture of a jar last week that is really going to kind of be a running picture for us. You see, many of us, we come to God wanting the clarity and the ability to hear from Him, yet the reality is we come and our jars, our lives look much more like this than the clear water. You see, every time something happens, it kind of stirs up our soul more and more and more, to the point where when we come and we sit still to be silent before God, we have all this stuff swirling around us, and we wonder why we can't hear Him or be attentive to Him or understand what He is trying to lead us or tell us. We have these moments where we are struggling just to connect with Him. It's because so much is happening in our lives. Well, the way to bring clarity to this water again is not to dump it out and start fresh. The way to get clarity to this water is to let it be still, to not move it, to not touch it, and slowly over time let the sediments just fall to the bottom. And if we give it enough time, if we give it enough space, what will happen is this water will become clear again in the way that we desire. The same is true when it comes to our hearts, our minds, our souls. When we sit still before God, sure, we may come and there may be a lot happening below the surface to the point where we are just struggling to connect to the heart of the Father. But as we slow ourselves, sit in solitude, we will ultimately have an easier ability to connect to the heart of the Father. This is why this practice is so important. We need to carve out space to simply be with Him and to let our hearts settle before Him. Last week, we really introduced the idea of solitude. And so if you haven't listened to last week's talk, I would highly encourage you to go back just so you can continue to follow with us. But this week, what I want us to do is I really want us to look at how did solitude impact Jesus' life. So let's look together at how Jesus spent His first day of ministry. Because this practice is not just a practice that we said, hey, let's pick this out. We picked this from Jesus' life. All the practices in our way of life come from the very life and practice of Jesus. And so in Matthew 13, we see really the first day of His public ministry. Verse 13 says this, "Then Jesus came from Galilee to Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, no, I need to be baptized by you. And do you come to me? Jesus replied, let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. And then John consented. And as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. And at that moment, heaven was opened. And he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. See, in many ways, many scholars look at this passage and say this is the first public ministry moment for Jesus. And the irony is it's not this big healing crusade that happens, but rather it's the heavens opening up, the Spirit descending upon Jesus, and God speaking affirmation and identity over him. And you would think that the very first thing Jesus does is he goes right to the synagogue or the temple courts and he begins to teach and heal people and tell them about the coming kingdom of heaven. You would imagine that he would march right up into the Roman rule and kind of dethrone them, just like all the Israelites thought the Messiah would come and do. But look at what happens the very next verse, Matthew 4:1. So then, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. That's not how you would imagine the first 40 days of your public ministry starting. Not in the temple courts, not in the places of influence or power. There's no Instagram. Jesus is not trending on Twitter or X. None of this is happening. Jesus instead goes out into the wilderness by himself under the leadership of the Spirit, where he fasts for 40 days and 40 nights and is tempted. The word used for wilderness here is an interesting word. It's called eremos. It's the Greek word for eremos. And this word means deserted place or desolate place or solitary place or quiet place. It can also be translated as wilderness. But what we see throughout all four Gospels is this word used to describe the space and the place that Jesus withdrew to often. This word is used throughout the Gospels to describe Jesus' pursuit of solitude. And what happens is Jesus goes, and many of us know the story. He goes into the wilderness. He's tempted 3 times by the enemy. Each time Jesus resists the enemy's temptations. And then he comes back to this area called Capernaum. And Mark 1 is really a summary of this first day. And this first day back from the wilderness is everything that you would expect it to be. It's teaching, it's calling disciples to himself, it's healing people. And this is what stands out to me. The very next day, after a busy, busy day, what do? If you're anything like me, I'm going to take a slow morning the next morning. I'm going to make sure my coffee is ready to go. I'm going to maybe kick up my feet and kind of chill, maybe watch a little TV, a little Sports Center to catch up on what's happened the previous day and all the things that I missed, right? This is what I would say probably the majority of people would do. But look at what Jesus does in Mark 1, verse 35. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, he left the house, and he went off to a solitary place, or the eremos, where he prayed. Simon and his companions, a couple of his disciples that he had just called to follow him, they went to go look for him. And when they found him, they exclaimed, "Jesus, everyone's looking for you. Where have you been?" And Jesus replied, "Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so that I can preach there also. This is why I have come." So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Again, Jesus, he kind of goes counter to what we would expect. He doesn't go and use his Chemex, make a nice pour over and just sit outside, right in front of a window to kind of just chill. No. He goes out of the house. He doesn't turn on the TV. He goes to a solitary place and he just prays. And naturally, the disciples, they come to him and they say, "Hey, let's go back. There's already a line of 30 people waiting for you, and it's not even light out yet, Jesus. Let's go back and continue all the great stuff that's happening." And Jesus says, "No, we're going to go here instead." And again, this was important for Jesus. And it wasn't something that he just lived. He wanted to instill this into the disciples and their hearts as well. In fact, when we go to Mark 6, we see that Jesus does this very thing. He instills these things into the hearts of the disciples. They've just been sent out. These 12 had just been sent out to go and do the work of the ministry. The very things that they had been watching Jesus do. He gave them power to do those things. And so they go around and amazing things happen. They come back and they're reporting these crazy things. Jesus, this man who had never been able to walk before, we prayed for him and now he can walk. Jesus, this guy, he was blind from birth. And guess what? We prayed over him and he can now see. Guess what? We talked to the whole synagogue in this area, this whole temple. And everyone started believing in who you are as Messiah. And so they're coming. They're like right here. Is it cool if they start following you? Like they're just telling Jesus everything that's going on. And look at what Jesus says in Mark 6. The apostles, they gathered around Jesus and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And then because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place." Translation, the eremos, and get some rest. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. I mean, think about this. This is the height of success for a first century rabbi. I mean, the crowds are literally coming to him, longing to follow him. I mean, they're so busy, they can't even eat their lunch. Been there? I know I have. And in the midst of it all, Jesus doesn't say, hey, we need to add to our team to begin to delegate responsibilities so that we can move more people through this healing line. Hey, we need to get some of you over here to start praying for people who are curious about who is Messiah. He doesn't do any of that. His response is, let's get away and rest. And again, Jesus doesn't just invite them to practice something that he's not preaching himself. In fact, right after this happens, they turn around and see that there's 5,000 plus people following them, and they're all hungry. And Jesus, because he's Jesus, he has compassion on them. And so Jesus feeds all 5,000 of these people. And as the crowds are amazed, he's realizing that it's hard for the disciples to get away. And look at what happens in verse 45. Mark 6:45, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into a boat. There's so much going on. Jesus says, you guys go get into the boat and go on ahead of me to Bethsaida. And while he stayed to dismiss the crowd, after leaving them, he got on a boat to catch up with the guys. No. He went up on a mountainside to the eremos to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake and Jesus was alone on land. See, Jesus loved the eremos. He lived out of a place of solitude with God. And I love that he didn't just tell the disciples to do something and said, we got busy, it was hard to follow up, we'll do better tomorrow, like I am prone to do. But rather, he made space for the disciples and he made sure to keep space for himself as well. In fact, the more and more you see throughout Jesus' life, you see that the more busy things were, he spent time alone with God. Luke 5 is a perfect summary of Jesus' life that we read last week. The news about him spread all the more so that the crowds of people came to hear him and be healed by their sickness. But Jesus often withdrew. Jesus often withdrew to lonely places, to the eremos, to pray. That's what he did. This is a summary of Jesus' life. Yes, he came to seek and to save the lost. Yes, he did that by eating and drinking with people who were far from him. But often throughout his life, he withdrew to lonely places to pray. Even at the end of his life, he knows that the cross is imminent. Judas has already left the group to go and betray him. Look at what Jesus does in Luke 22. Jesus went out as usual. I mean, that's intentional language that Luke was including here. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. The Mount of Olives, we imagine it being like this nice kind of grove. It was a place where olive trees would kind of grow and everything would happen there. But what was interesting about its placement is that it was right on the edge of the Judean wilderness. It was kind of right in between the Temple Mount and the Judean wilderness, the Judean desert. And right in that spot was Jesus' place to go as usual. That was his space of solitude, his eremos, to go and be with God. So much so that Judas, who was leading a group of guys to betray him, didn't have to wonder, I wonder where Jesus will be at this time at night. He knew exactly where to look for him. Verse 47 says, while he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. Judas knew exactly where to find Jesus at this time because he was there often. It was his usual spot to simply be with God. I read to you all these passages because in the midst of Jesus, looking at Jesus' life, I want us to understand that solitude was not a one-time event for Jesus. Rather, it was a regular rhythm in his life. Solitude was not something that he just did a time and then felt good, kind of gave him a pat on the back and said, God, we'll connect again soon, but I got a lot of stuff to do down here. Rather, it was something that he carved out in his life on a regular, daily, sometimes more basis so that he could be with God. And again, there are stories in all four Gospels where Jesus would withdraw from the crowds, withdraw from the to-do list, withdraw from the hustle and bustle of life to be still before God. It was his way of making that time the most important time, that time to connect to the heart of the Father. And this is why solitude is so important for you and for me. We need to build this practice into the regular rhythm of our days, our weeks, our months, and our years. And we need to create space so that we can connect to the heart of God. And again, it doesn't matter which gospel you read. This is the pattern that Jesus' life set for you and for me. And again, what's interesting is that you can see, especially in the Gospel of Luke, that the busier Jesus was, the more time he spent in the eremos. If you could kind of read through the Gospel of Luke, what you will see is that you could chart Jesus' life on two axes. One is the busier that he was, the other is the more time he spent with Jesus. And what you will see is that that line will increase throughout the Gospel of Luke. The busier Jesus was, the more time he spent in the eremos. He spent in solitude. And isn't it the exact opposite for us? In seasons of busyness, the first thing to go is the quiet place. Maybe I shouldn't project that onto you. I'll tell you from my own experience. The first thing that goes when I am busy is the quiet place. When life is hectic and people are demanding, our time, often the time that we lose for God is that unhurried space to just sit and be with him. And the temptation that I face in ministry is that, I got to do more for God in this busy season. And I have to remind myself, fight against it so often, that God is not interested in my doing. He's interested in my being with him. In seasons of busyness, we need more time with God in the quiet place, not less. And again, you probably have a million excuses running through your head right now. You have little kids at home, or you have a demanding job, or you're an extrovert, or you just struggle to sit still. I get all of those, okay? I get all of those. But I want you to stop for a minute and think about this reality, that Jesus needed time in the quiet place. This was not something that Jesus wanted to do. I believe Jesus needed this time in the quiet place. But why? Why is this such a necessary thing for Jesus? I believe that it's because the eremos isn't a place of weakness. The eremos is a place of strength. This is important for us to understand. In the quiet place, Jesus' life and ministry was strengthened by God. And I believe this is why Jesus went there so often, to be strengthened in his life and to carry out his mission. Even if we just go back to those first passages that we read in Matthew 4 and Mark 1, Jesus going out into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Like, I don't know about you, but I used to always read that verse and think that it was weird that the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness. And I used to read it like, isn't that just like the devil? Like, at the end of your busyness and the end of when you're exhausted and tired and hungry, that's when he comes and attacks you. When you are at your weakest, that's when he comes to pounce. And that could be true. But I used to read Matthew 4:1 as a story of weakness. But now I believe that I've been reading that wrong most of my life. I believe that the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness because it did not weaken Jesus, but it strengthened him. It was in the eremos and only in the eremos that Jesus was at the height of his spiritual power. You see, after 40 days and 40 nights in solitude and fasting, Jesus was now at the capacity, at the beginning part of his ministry, to take the devil on himself and walk away unscathed. You see, this is what we need to understand. So often I think of the eremos as a place of just time where I could be doing other things. But it's actually a place of strength. It's a place of strength where we are connected clearly to God. How is it a place of strength? Well, again, I just want to focus in on Matthew 4, the story of the wilderness, and Mark 1, that first day of Jesus' ministry when he came back. Because I think this passage teaches us how solitude, the eremos, strengthens us. The first thing that we'll see is solitude strengthens our identity. It strengthens our identity. Jesus is baptized. God sees him in this moment and speaks identity, life over Jesus. You are my son. In you, I am well pleased and I love you. This is what God speaks over Jesus. And then Jesus goes right into the wilderness. And in his temptation, the enemy does not go after all the abilities that Jesus has, but what's the first thing that the enemy says to Jesus? If you are the Son of God. That's how he starts off each temptation. If you are the Son of God. Jesus had just had the heavens open and a voice declare that that is who he is. And the first thing that the enemy seeks to steal, kill, and destroy within Jesus is his view of his identity. If you are the Son of God, then you would do this. If you are the Son of God, second temptation, then you would do this. You see, but in the eremos, Jesus was reminded and strengthened in who he was. It was in the eremos that he began to hold on to the reality that he is the Son of God. And again, we believe that he knew this. We believe that this is why he came. But in the eremos, he was strengthened in that will and that resolve. You see, our identity brings clarity to who we are and what we were created to do. And when we begin to question who we are, what we begin to experience is that we begin to question other things about our lives as well. And we look to others to give us clarity about what we should be doing. And therefore, as a result, we get sucked into the rat race of life and we become molds of the world around us. And so identity is key in our lives. I used to hate it when my dad would say, Rick, you are a berry, and this is what we do. And I'm like, blah, blah, blah. Now I hated it. But now I find myself like looking at my kids and saying similar things. But it's not to be like, raise up the berry flag. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to speak identity over them, that this is who you are. This is who God has created you to be. And this is what you are invited to experience as a result of those things. And so this is the opportunity. In solitude, we are able to sit with that reality. And in solitude, our identity becomes clear. And our purpose and meaning in life become clear as clear connection to it. Jesus knew who he was as a beloved Son of God, that his Father loved him and that he was proud of him. And then for 40 days, he was strengthened by that reality in the wilderness, to the point where when the enemy tried to dismantle it, it didn't work. In solitude, we will sit in the loving and encouraging voice that the Father speaks over us. You will discover that you are loved, that you are a masterpiece, that you are chosen, that you are God's child, that you are known, that you are not alone, that you are free, that you are a new creation, that you are mighty in his power. These realities from Scripture come to us in the midst of solitude. And if you are in solitude and you hear a voice of shame or a voice of confusion, then I want you to hear me clearly today that that is not the voice of the Father. That is the voice of the enemy trying to seek to attack your identity and take you off course. Whenever there is theft, death, destruction, and deception, we know that the enemy is at work. So in solitude, our identity is strengthened. And if we continue to sit in solitude, what will happen is we will experience the reality that solitude opens us up to the voice of God. This is kind of the constant reality that we see in Jesus' experience of solitude. And for us, we have constant noise in our ears. Again, we have a podcast playing at all time. We have music going. We are listening to people's thoughts on the radio, or we're talking on the phone. We always seem to have someone else's voice in our ear. But the most important voice that we should be listening to is the Father's voice. We need it more clearly now than ever before, and we receive God's word, or God's voice to us through his word. And so in solitude, we are opened up to the voice of God. As we spend time in solitude, we will hear the Father's voice through his word and through the Spirit that is always in agreement with his word. Jesus didn't overcome the enemy in the wilderness with a divine set of tools that none of us have access to. This is what I love about this passage. No, Jesus uses the very things that we have access to as well. Jesus used God's word to refute each of the enemy's temptations in his life. And the same can be true for you and for me. This was Jesus' strategy. Every time the enemy tempted him, in each scenario, Jesus responded with the very word of God. God's voice was in Jesus' ear and on Jesus' lips. He knew what his Father's voice sounded like, and what Satan was saying didn't sound anything like it. Just the other day, I was walking into my our basement, and my 4-year-old daughter was like playing with something, and I said to my 8-year-old, I said, "Watch this. I'm gonna mess with Ava right now." And so I go to Ava and I say, "Ava, come here now!" Like she spilled something, and she literally didn't even stop playing with the toy. She looked down and said, "Dad, I know you're kidding. Give me a break," just like that. And I was like, what? Like, I have no power. A prophet has no honor in his own home, like that's kind of the thing. I was like, what is happening? And I said, "Honey, how did you know I was kidding?" And she said, "I heard it in your voice. I could tell." Apparently, I'm not very intimidating. But this is the reality. Like, she knows my voice. And she knows that, like, I wouldn't just come in guns blazing just like that. I wouldn't come in full throttle. She could hear the intonation in my voice to the point where she said, "Give me a break." Like, this is the reality. As sheep, we need to know what our shepherd's voice sounds like. In solitude, we are able to sit in stillness and in silence, and yet hear the most important thing that we can hear. We are silencing the external noise and the internal noise in our own lives so that the water can become clear, so that we can see what God is doing in our lives. There may be days when we begin to wrestle with a text. There may be days when we wrestle with an emotion or a sin that we are struggling with, but in solitude, we will hear the voice of God speak over those areas. Life, affirmation, affection, identity, and he will point us to what he has to say. In solitude, we are opened up to God's voice. And as we hear God's voice, we'll understand that solitude ultimately brings clarity to our calling. For a long time, I used to treat solitude as a way to kind of twist God's arm to hear. I would say, okay, I got to go to solitude so I can hear what God has to say about this. And that's okay. I think there's moments when that's necessary. But I think oftentimes what I need to do is I don't need to seek what I can get out of God. I just need to seek God. And in solitude, going back to the eremos regularly, I will receive clarity in my calling. You see, right after Jesus comes back from the wilderness, he goes into an area called Capernaum. And again, he has kind of the typical day of ministry. He's doing a lot. He's teaching, he's calling people to himself, he's healing. And the very next day, instead of going back and doing it again, just like the disciples want him to do, they say, "Jesus, come on, there's a crowd already waiting." He says, no, we're not going back here. We're going to go over there because that is why I have come. In the solitude, Jesus was reminded and strengthened of the reason that he came. In solitude, Jesus was able to know exactly what to say yes to, and more importantly, what to say no to. And this is another reason why the eremos was a top priority for Jesus. And if we're honest with one another, we all have things in our lives that we're looking for clarity on. All of us. We often look at the pros and cons of the big decisions that we have, and we think that God works in that way. He uses our wisdom and our discernment, which he does use. But there are other times when he will speak to go right when everyone else is saying it makes more sense to go left. And we need to walk in obedience to the calling that he has given to us. How do we know what to do in those times when we need clarity? We need to still ourselves before him. We need to seek him through prayer. We need to look to his word, and we need to ask Holy Spirit to lead us into God's will for our lives. Those are the moments. But I think so often what happens is we read and 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 we talk 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 and we talk. We never give God any space to simply respond. And God uses the word. Absolutely. But there are other moments in our lives where the Spirit comes and uses the word to just give us peace, give us clarity, give us understanding. Jesus was reminded of his calling in solitude, and that's how he was able to remind the disciples of why he came. Perhaps this is why, again, the busier that Jesus was, the more time he spent in solitude, so that he could know what God was doing around him and how he can engage with it to accomplish his calling and mission. Solitude strengthens us. It is a place of strength for you and I. And if we are longing for this place, the eremos, then we will begin to experience this strengthening that Jesus experienced. It's a place of strengthening our understanding of our identity. It strengthens our ability to hear his voice, and it strengthens our ability to discern what he's doing and calling us to in our lives. Ultimately, what I really believe when it comes down to the eremos, to this place of solitude, that solitude is a place where you can ultimately find life with God. See, we've talked about this often. Solitude is not just a way to kind of get into our Bible or just to get into pray, but it's about ourselves learning more about how to live with God. And we've talked about this regularly, that people are longing for life in all different areas. They look for it to be satisfied in their work or in their families or in their hobbies. Whatever it is for different people, people are looking for life in these areas. But ultimately, they are left longing for more. They are left empty. And it's because ultimately, God has created each of us to find life in him. And when we sit in solitude, when we are still before him and we are able to know that he is God, then we will ultimately find God in those moments. We will begin to experience joy, contentment, peace that we have been longing for in all the other areas of our lives. The invitation for us is to simply sit and be still and let everything settle to the bottom so that we can clearly hear from him and experience life with him. If you are longing for life with God, then I want to invite you to carve out time to be with him each and every day. Last week in our city group, we were talking about this, and Jen mentioned, she said, I grew up always talking about my morning quiet time. And she said, but really quiet time was just kind of church speak for time to read my Bible and pray in the morning. And she said, really, this is kind of getting back to the heart of maybe what quiet time was meant to look like. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly what it is. We're inviting you to kind of have a morning quiet time again. But instead of get through a whole bunch of content and do more in that time, we're actually inviting you to do less. To simply be still, to enjoy that time with him. So tomorrow morning, over a cup of coffee or tea, if that's your drink of choice. Find your spot. For me, I'll be back in the leather chair in my office and simply be still before God. If you don't know how to start your time, maybe you try reading a psalm or read a story from the gospel. Sit and just repeat, "Here I am. Speak. Your servant is listening." And listen for the Father's voice. If you're struggling, sit still before him and keep listening. Maybe you will hear something from him that will change the trajectory of your life. Maybe you'll process your anger over something that's bothering you. Maybe you'll feel peace as your worries settle to the bottom. Maybe your mind will never actually come to rest. If any of those things happen, that's okay, because you carved out time to be with the Father. So my invitation to you is come back the next day. Same time, same place. And start your day or carve out your day, time in your day to be in the Eremos.